Hello! Welcome to Time for Music at Home. This is the fourth in our series of online concerts inviting you into the homes of the musicians. And so welcome to my home and my home haircut. So my name is Thomas Georgi, and actually today is perhaps my final concert as a professional musician. I joined Time for Music in 1989, and I've been here ever since. And today I'm going to play some new things for you before I run out of time. I left them obviously to the very last minute. So I'm going to play the violin, and although this is my last concert, this is actually this violin's first concert. I've been making this violin on and off over the last 7 years, mostly off, of course. And when we got to this season, I started to work on it seriously, and then the pandemic hit, and it was just the most perfect project for the pandemic. Sit quietly working on fitting the bass bar or fitting the neck to the body. That was just the most perfect kind of work for the time that we are in, for me. And so I'd like to show you, actually, by way of comparison, because one of the things that's frustrating to me with my new violin is I can't compare it to other people's violins because we're all physically distanced. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start our concert this morning by playing a few bars on a violin that I've played for the Time for Music audience on and off for the last 20 years. And that's this violin here. I'm going to play Herschel's Caprice 7. Now, William Herschel may not be a familiar name to you, but actually probably it'll ring a bell because Herschel was the astronomer who first noticed that Uranus was a planet. And actually he had many more discoveries to his name than that. And maybe we'll talk about them in between some of the other caprices that we play. But first of all, let's just establish the violin that I am sure many of you have heard me play a number of times. And this is what that very same opening 8 bars sounds like on the violin that I finally got playing about 3 weeks ago. Now, of course, I'm prejudiced. I'm pleased as punch with my new violin, but you can make up your own minds. So, as I said, I'm going to play some things that I've never got to before, and nobody else has ever got to before, and in this case, a few of the caprices of William Herschel. These date from before his astronomical activities kind of overwhelmed everything else that he was doing. Eventually, he was actually given a stipend. He was one of the first people paid to be an astronomer, and his sister Caroline was perhaps the second to be paid to be an astronomer. But before that all happened, He actually made a living as a freelance musician at that time. That I think he wrote these caprices for the solo violin. He lived in Bath, and he made a living mostly by teaching. He taught violin, he taught guitar, he taught keyboard, he taught singing, and maybe he taught the oboe, which was actually his first instrument. So let's hear one more caprice. This is actually Caprice 9. And I'm going to have to save time here. I'm going to only play the A section and B section. I'm not going to take the repeats of them. All of these little caprices are little binary forms, but to save time, I'm just going to play them once through for you. So here's Caprice 9. Now, Herschel is actually fairly well known, not as a musician, but as a scientist. But what's not so well known about him is that he was actually kind of motivated into astronomy and cosmology. He was actually quite interested in the structure of the universe. Haydn visited him one of the times he was in London, and people do credit Haydn's visit to Herschel with the remarkable structure of the beginning of Haydn's creation. All of the stuff up to that wonderful joke, "Let there be light," where you get the fortissimo C major chord. But Herschel had obviously quite a vigorous imagination. So for instance, he was actually always looking for aliens. And one of the places he was imagining could possibly have aliens was on the sun. And obviously the sun is hot, and so Herschel had this scheme in his mind where there would, of course, be the hot outer layer of the sun, but there would be a kind of a cloud layer under it that would insulate the residents of the sun from the heat. And of course, they had to look out because, like Herschel, they would have been interested in the universe, right? So that's why there are sunspots. So I'm sure this made a lot of people raise their eyebrows, whether internally or externally. And Herschel's caprices have certain points where this happens as well, which is why probably nobody's ever played you one before. I'll just give you a few bars of the sort of place that colleagues of mine look at and they say, oh, something must be wrong. So I can't remember which caprice this is. There is actually a free version of this that you can find online as a part of a doctoral thesis by a student at University of North Texas. So if you care to check out on it. But here is the sort of thing that I think probably Herschel's musical contemporaries raised their eyebrows at. And so on and so forth. It's, you know, I imagine if they had their Dramamine at that time, they were probably reaching for their Dramamine. Anyway, he's a very interesting figure, and it's easy actually to learn quite a lot about him, and I got the best feel for how he actually lived from a book called Recollections of the Stage by John Bernard, and you can get that easily on Google Books. There's a very charming anecdote actually when John Bernard recounts actually having lessons with Herschel because John Bernard was an actor and he was called on to sing in operas, and he couldn't read music, so he needed somebody to help him learn the arias, and Herschel did that, and for free. So I want to play, actually I think this is going to probably be my last number. So I'll play one more Caprice, and I think this is Caprice 13. Yeah, and just a note at this point, if you have any questions through the performance that you're hearing, you can write it down at the end. There is actually the possibility of asking questions of my colleagues Pat and Margaret. And if you would care to ask me a question about some of the crazy stuff I just showed you, you can easily find me online at This is Viola d'Amore, all one word, YouTube channel. Okay, so this is Caprice 13. And after that, I want to talk to you about what I'm going to name the violin. Yeah. Now, of course, violins don't need to be named, but very briefly before I go, I'm just going to say, I think I'm going to call it for my mother's high school English teacher. Actually, my mother had two English teachers in high school, Mrs. Noon and Bernice Ford, and they were the only two adult friends that I ever knew that my mother had. When she died, Bernice actually gave my mother a number of her things, including her sewing machine, some of her books, and her parents' square grand piano. Now, as it happens, my father turned Bernice's square grand piano into a desk, and so I'll drop in a picture at this point to show you Bernice's square grand piano as my sister's desk in her office. But here on this violin, I have other pieces of Bernice's piano. I got the ebony keys of the piano, and I made them into the saddle, which is this thing here, and I made it into the nut, which is here. And in fact, Bernice's ebony keys are actually supporting the tension on this violin, just as she supported my mother through high school. So I'm going to call it the Bernsky. Thank you very much for listening all these years. Top Music, you know how much I love to tour. It was great. My colleagues in Australia, I'm sorry. You were right. I was wrong. I should never have left Australia. I'm sure I'll see you around. In the meantime, over to my colleague Pippa.